What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Average Fan Podcast. And boy, do we have a lot to talk about. Hartford Athletic is continuing to win games. Their home opener happened, and there's plenty to talk about, whether it's on or off the field. And then we also have another installment of the rivalry that has barely played at all. We've really never been able to see it play out. A game between Rhode Island and Hartford Athletic in the U.S. Open Cup. And finally, we will touch on the upcoming USL Championship match between Hartford Athletic and Miami FC, the Miami FC. Let me give them their credit. But Oliver, how is it covering a team that can just refuse to lose games?
I mean, if they didn't lose all season, that would make my job super easy. I know when I started doing this and Hartford were kind of bad, like you were occasionally DMing me like, I am so sorry that you have to write about another terrible loss. And this is a lot more fun.
Yeah, I mean, always feel bad for my boy Josh Nye covering Revs too. Essentially, basically consider it hazard pay for what he's had to go through. Luckily, Hartford Athletic is performing quite well. Let's go back in the way back machine. Go back to the most recent matches. We'll start off with the match against Hartford Athletic against Brooklyn FC. Able to get the 2-1 win. Sounded like it was an interesting atmosphere. Going down to Coney Island and seeing, from what I've heard from Hartford Athletic fans, but. Just overall, what were your takeaways from that match, Oliver, in terms of Hartford, being able to pick up the 3 points on the road?
Well, the 3 points on the road were great. That was incredible. This is a team that has not ever, or until last season, had not ever been good on the road. And then last season, they figured it out. They were incredible on the road. And they've kind of picked up where they left off. So that's really, really good. I think from that game, we learned a couple of things. One is that when this team is clicking and they have the right guys on the pitch, they can be very, very good. First half, they were up 2-0. Barry Coffey, who was an offseason addition, had a goal and an assist. They didn't look like they were killing it. They weren't, dominating every phase of the game, but they were up 2-0 and they deserved to be ahead. Second half, they just didn't have the juice. They didn't have any substitutes to make. Brooklyn made some changes and absolutely dominated the second half of the game. They outshot Hartford 17-5. They got one goal. If they'd got two more and won that game 3-2, it absolutely would have been, no more than they deserved on the back of the performance they had in the second half. Anthony Siaha had to come up big on a couple of occasions. Peter Mangione hit the woodwork with a header as well. I think what we saw there was the best case scenario for Hartford is that they are a very good football club. The worst case scenario is that they just aren't deep enough. They don't have the horses. They don't have the juice. They were playing in that game guys who had been on, had on 25-day contracts. Galen Flynn played in that game. Spencer Gordon, who's an academy player, came on late as well. Those are not moves are not decisions that I think Brendan Burke wants to be making about. Is this a game where Spencer Gordon is going to get some minutes? That doesn't feel like the way this team was set up in the offseason. So I think what we took away from that was it's great to get points on the road. This team has a very high ceiling, and the resources just haven't quite been there. And the thing I want to connect that up to is that part of the reason this roster is so thin is because there have been a bunch of injuries. There have been a bunch of soft tissue injuries. And that is partly, not exclusively, but partly a consequence of not really having had a proper offseason. This club did not go away. They did not go on a training trip to Florida as they've done in the past. My understanding is that was cut for budgetary reasons. And that, I think, ultimately is one of the larger problems that Hartford Athletic still has, is that they aren't fully invested at this level that you need to be. You need to go away for a month, maybe 3 weeks at the minimum, but you need to take that trip where you get away, you're able to get in every training session, the guys are able to get the full recovery, and it's not the experience they were having this offseason where they missed some days because they couldn't get into the dome because there were 3 feet of snow in Hartford, or, whatever it was, or there was a holiday or they got bumped because, some other organization was using the space. Like, that's not where this club needs to be. So I think when you have a bunch of guys, Michi Galina, Samuel Kuryaga, Adiwali Balola, Sebastian Anderson, there's a couple of other guys picking up these soft tissue injuries at this stage of the season is an indication that the preparation wasn't there. And in this case, we have a pretty clear indication of why the preparation wasn't.
Yeah, and I think, that's an even more poignant point in the fact that we're still going with the USL PA negotiations, labor negotiations with the USL. I mean, the fact that the players weren't able to get, a real off season in, you're kind of seeing those tangible and unfortunate results play out. And, as we're getting deeper into the season, we're seeing protests continue and kind of take new forms. So it really seems like it's all playing out, and again, not, making the USL look that great. And I think, maybe before we go to the next topic, I want to touch on this game. I guess I'd love to get your thoughts, Oliver. Just the fact that we are still in a labor negotiation. We're seeing, these protests continue to evolve, and doesn't look like they'll stop anytime soon. Just what are kind of, some of your thoughts, the fact that we are still in this situation where the players are in limbo, and there doesn't really seem to be any potential of an agreement happening between the USL and the USLPA.
Yeah, it's a really unfortunate. I think it's given that the amount of money that seems to be at issue is not particularly large, probably measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars, honestly, over the life of the contract is really disappointing, right? That's still what we're talking about. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that it kind of came out this week that Justin Papadakis, who's been an executive with the USL for a number of years. Obviously, his father is a majority owner of the league, part of New Rock. He's leaving. He's not going to be in that role anymore. And we don't really have a ton of information about why. The league was pretty tight-lipped about it. It was just he's moving on to new opportunities. But the vibe from people who were reporting on it was that some of USL's new partners, particularly their private equity partners, have not been super enamored of what the league is doing from an operational standpoint in terms of protecting their investment and seeing it grow. And it's not too hard to draw the line here that Justin Papadakis is someone who was front and center with the expansion orientation of the league, with the kind of very heavy real estate orientation of the league, that this was not just about adding soccer clubs, but also about building these potentially lucrative real estate investment opportunities as well. And that he's the one that's kind of been shown the door, however that came to be, suggests that maybe some of these other partners are not happy about that. They're not seeing the potential for the return on their investment. So I don't necessarily know that means we're going to see an agreement occur. But I will say, if you're sitting at a bargaining table and you're the side that is changing your leadership, that's not a strong position to be going back to the bargaining table in the next time, to say, well, I'd be like, where's Justin? And I don't know if Justin was at the bargaining table. I'm not suggesting that was the case, but people are like, what happened to Justin? Where's he at? Haven't seen him around. That's a weak position that you're in then, because you're the one who's had to be like, oh, things aren't really working over here.
Yeah, exactly. And, maybe before we move on from this Brooklyn match, would love to get your thoughts on the fact that the likes of Barry Coffey and Augustine Williams are performing, so well relatively quickly, whenever you get a new acquisition, whether it's kind of, a player joining a new league or a player even just joining a new team, there can really be kind of a feeling out period and kind of an adjustment period. Just what do you think it says about these two players that they've been able to adjust, relatively quickly and have been able to make an impact, relatively fast?
Well, looking at Augustine Williams first, he's a guy he's a consummate professional. He's been around, it feels like he's been around forever, right? He's not even, I think he's like turning 29 this year. And he's been around for such a long time. He knows exactly what he's doing. There's nothing in this league that can surprise a guy like Augustine Williams. One thing that I've noticed this season with him is that he is a player who over the last few seasons has had a tendency to take a lot of really low quality shots. And without really watching a ton of tape, I don't really know exactly why that's the case. But when you look at his numbers, he's taking a lot of shots from outside the box. He's taking a lot of shots from unpromising positions. That has not been the case with Hartford. He has been in very, very good positions. Most, if not all, of the shots that he's taken have been of a good quality. And that's a really, really promising sign that he is exactly where this team wants him to be, to take those opportunities in the way that he maybe wasn't with Pittsburgh, or that he wasn't with Indy, or that he wasn't with Charleston. And let's remember that with Pittsburgh, he won the title. So if he's in an even better position than he was last year with Pittsburgh, if he's locked in a way that maybe he wasn't fully able to be last season, that's an incredible sign. And I think it's a reflection on Augustine Williams, adapting very quickly, that he's very professional, he's very measured in his approach, he knows exactly what to do, and also a sign that this team signed the right guy. That they went out and they acquired the forward that they needed. And you could make the argument like, oh, maybe MD Myers or Kel Jennings or one of these other guys might have been a, quote, better signing. But it appears that Augustine Williams has absolutely fit where they need him to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to score 20 goals, but he's fitting in doing exactly the things they need him to be doing. Barry Coffey is really interesting to me because you literally have no idea. You bring a guy in from abroad, and unless it's like, oh, he's coming from the Premier League, and we spent $27 million to get this guy here, like, you don't know what you're getting. You're going to the League of Ireland, you're going to Estonia or like the Spanish third tier, or all these places, and you really just don't know what you're going to get when you get that guy over here and he has to adjust to what is in many cases a more physical atmosphere. That is the case for a lot of the European leagues. It's a league that is not renowned for its kind of technical level of play, if we're being honest, right? It's a pretty physical league across all the 25 teams. And Barry Coffey has really looked like he belonged. It's not 100%. He's not, there's definitely been times where he's not on the same page with the other guys, or maybe he's trying to do a little bit too much. But that 45 minutes in Brooklyn, he was great. And if he can turn that kind of performance in on a regular basis, this is going to work out real well. He's still probably not going to score 26 goals like he did last season in Ireland, just because of the level of the competition. But he's absolutely a guy who can contribute both with his own goal scoring and his ability to create for his teammates here. And that's really, really promising. And again, just a sign of a player who's very professional and has been able to adapt very quickly.
Yeah, and I think too when you talk about maybe coming over from a physical league, whether it's all the way up to MLS or you know mainly just soccer in the United States, it really is a physical game, and not only on the field, but you also have physical demands in terms of your travel and what have you off the field. So maybe that's partly why a guy like Barry Coffey's been able to have a relatively good adjustment period so far. But I guess it's kind of putting the bow on this Brooklyn match. Just what maybe stood out about the opposition, obviously a new team to the league. Like you said, in the second half was really able to ramp up the efforts, trying to push for a goal or potentially draw a level. Just what were your thoughts on what you saw from Brooklyn?
Uh, the one thing that really jumped out to me is that they brought in Juan Carlos Obregon, right, who's a former Hartford Athletic player and had absolutely dominated League One over the last two seasons with Charlotte and Westchester. But I wonder if they're actually not missing a real proven championship level goal scorer. They created opportunities. They were not short on their ability to get the ball forward and get into dangerous areas. And they didn't really feel like they necessarily had quite the cutting edge that you might be looking for. And that's shown up in a couple of their other games too, right? Obregon has scored a penalty, but he hasn't, I don't think, at this point, scored from open play. And that's maybe not what you're wanting to see from your number 9 at this point in the season, that he's not putting the ball in the back of the net. And he's a player that I have a lot of respect for. He's a very versatile player. He works very, very hard. I liked him when he was here in Hartford. He got 15 goals across 2 seasons. You cannot sneeze at that. But I also wonder if maybe they're missing a guy. I don't want to say they should take Augustine Williams. I like having him here in Hartford. But are they missing a guy like that who's got a little bit more of that killer instinct at the championship level? And that might be a move if they're able to sustain some success throughout the summer, get to a point where they're contending for a playoff spot. I could see them being interested in acquiring a player from another team that maybe isn't reaching that playoff level, but who does have that, have that capability. Just throwing a name out there, if Birmingham were to scuffle through the summer, I could see them maybe being interested in acquiring someone like Ronaldo Damas, because it does feel a little bit like that's what they're missing right now.
Got you. And, obviously we'll then now head over to the home opener, the match against Indy 11. But before we kind of get to, the product on the field and the match, would love to get your thoughts, Oliver, just maybe your first impressions walking into the stadium, just from what I've been able to gather, from hearing from Hartford fans. It seemed like the experience was maybe a little different, maybe a little subpar to what they were used to, but just overall, just for yourself, what was the experience like walking into the stadium for the first time this season.
I mean, on the one hand, it's the home opener. Watching soccer on TV is fine, but being in the stadium, there's nothing to replace it, right? So like I was just really excited. It was 38 degrees or something, but I still managed to be excited to be at the stadium. Um, I will say though, it did not feel like it was a well-oiled machine on the operational side of things going into this game. And just a couple of examples of this that kind of popped up, over the course of the night. One, there were no porta potties in the parking lot for fans ahead of the game, and that's been pretty consistent over the last few years. That there have been porta potties there, so fans who are participating in pre-match tailgate or anything like that have those facilities available to them, and that's felt like a pretty kind of basic oversight. And if it's not an oversight, then it's concerning in a different way, right? If it was a deliberate choice, then that feels like a bigger problem. There were some logistical snafus inside the stadium. Fans who were picking up their season ticket members' gift, their scarf, and other things had a very long line. It felt like there maybe wasn't the level of organization around that there had been in previous seasons. There were definitely some critiques that the promotional offerings were not at the level that fans have become accustomed to. The club has done away with the previous $2 beer, $1 hot dog night to now be $3 pizza, $2 beer, $1 popcorn night, I believe is what it is. And the home opener was the first $2 beer night of the season. And the cups were really small. Now, I'll be honest, it was 38 degrees. I opted for coffee instead of beer, which is maybe the only time in my life you're ever going to hear me say that.
Wow.
I know. And I will say, then seeing the size of the cups people were walking away from the stand with, I was like, I think I made the right choice buying an overpriced coffee as opposed to 6 ounces of beer or whatever it was. I think I saw one fan say it was a Dixie cup size, and it was a little bigger than that. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. But I think taken all together, these are the kinds of things that don't happen in a club that kind of operationally has everything lined up. And we've seen a bunch of turnover over the last 18 months with this club. I think most of the folks who were in operations last season are gone. Lily Donatelli, who had been in charge of operations for a number of years, left during the middle of last season. It was a huge loss for this club just in terms of the institutional knowledge around that. We've seen major turnover in the ticketing department. I think, I'm also a season ticket holder. I think I've had 3 season ticket reps now since the end of last season, which is not great. And it's not great because it creates a little bit of chaos, but it also, there's always that kind of institutional knowledge loss. What has to happen on what time frame? If you want porta potties in the parking lot, when do you have to call the company to order them? What's the best way to set up the line to make sure everyone can get their season ticket, gift or whatever it is? All of these things that have to happen. And if you've never done them before, it's very, very easy to make a mistake. It's very, very easy to not realize something that has to happen. And I imagine that when we get back here in 10 days and it's the next home game against El Paso, a lot of that stuff will have been cleaned up because it's very easy to fix once you're aware of what the problems are. But it does speak to a little bit of a larger problem with this club, which has been the turnover in the front office, which has been pretty significant over the last 18 months. I think there's like 36 people who've kind of come and gone over that time period for a club that it has about 25 full-time employees. So it is a pretty hefty turnover, and it does cause or contribute to some of these issues, particularly the kinds of things that we saw on Saturday.
Yeah, and I guess, specifically maybe at the USL Championship level, it seems like these things might be a little bit more important than maybe your typical MLS club. I mean, the competition, is not maybe as, you know, just frankly based off the rankings of the leagues. It might not be up to par with MLS. So I feel like there's almost a need for better customer relationships. And, when you have these promotions and when you have these kind of, season ticket holder kind of rewards, if you will, they seem very valuable and something that can attract people to the product and really, create a just soccer fan for life, never mind, someone who's really invested in Hartford Athletic. I'd love to just get your thoughts on, the importance, of something. I think, for some people, a $2 beer that might be small might seem like, crying over a bit of spilled milk. But, I think for these fans who are going to a freezing cold game, and, are supporting this team game in and game out, these things definitely matter, especially at the USL Championship level.
Yeah, 100%. I think, everything I'd heard from club employees in the past was that $2 beer was, with maybe one exception, by far their best promotional night. They could goose a turnout with $2 beer. No other promotion would do that, or at least not on a consistent basis. Um, and I think that is kind of an indication of what kind of league this is, right? Is that that's not really going to be like if you're the Revolution, $2 beer. Well, I don't know. Maybe at the Razor, $2 beer would make a difference. I've seen their concession prices, so maybe I shouldn't speak too quickly on that. But the reality is that this is a league where something like that can make a big difference, right? It can make a big difference between a 2,500 person night and a 3,500 person night, right? Some people are attracted by the $2 beer. They bring their friends, they bring their family, whatever it is. It can really goose the number. And then those people are in the stadium and they're having a couple of beers and they buy some food and then they're drunk. So they're like, a $90 jersey. That sounds like a great deal, right? And like the whole thing kind of like, spirals from there, right? But it's important, right? It's important for the club's bottom line. It's important for the merchandise. It's important for everything, right? To have those people in the stadium. And I think if you lose sight of that at any point as a club, you're losing sight of what's making this work, which is the people showing up and the people who care about it and who are going to tell their friends like, hey, you should come to a Hartford athletic game because it's a really great time. The $2 beer is a great deal. They really care about the fans. There's this great connection, all of these things. And that's not the way a lot of fans appear to feel about the club right now, particularly those really hardcore fans, the people who are in the supporters groups, the people who are season ticket members, right, and have been for a number of years. They don't feel taken care of, right? They don't feel like the club cares about them. They don't feel like the club is invested in having them continue to come back. And that is potentially a longer term problem. Now, again, it's one game, right? We get to next weekend and they've cleaned a bunch of this stuff up and there's porta potties in the parking lot and the next $2 beer, the cups are a different size. It'll all be forgotten, at least for now. And the other thing I'll say too is that because the club is actually putting out results on the field, this stuff has a lot less traction than it did maybe in previous seasons where there was nothing to cheer about on the field before Brendan Burke arrived. And so anytime there was any kind of operational failure, people, really latched onto it. So I think these things really, really matter. And I personally, if it was up to me, I would really want to be more invested in these relationships than it sometimes appears that the club is. Um, Even though I know like some people are always going to complain about something, right? So there is kind of like a limit to what you can do to make people happy, but they matter. And I think if you go around the league, you know, promotional nights drive crowds, whether it's $2 beer or pause on the pitch or, something else like that. Like these are things that drive attendance, that drive connection, that keep people coming back, that make them bring their friends, that make them bring their families. And if Hartford wants to maintain that kind of market and maintain those people, then they really have to maintain a clear vision on that and not lose sight of it and forget to rent porta potties for the parking lot.
Yes, I think the main message should be that have a place for people to be able to go to the bathroom in the parking lot. Bare minimum expect.
That's number one and number two.
There you go, Oliver. There you go, man. Get this man on Kimmel. But Oliver, now to the product on the field, like you said. The team is performing well. They weren't able to get all 3 points, but, thanks to an own goal, we're able to draw level and take away at least something from the match, especially being there in person. Just, what stood out about Hartford's performance against Indy 11.
Yeah, I think the two things that really stood out to me were one, this team is a lot deeper than even last year's team, despite the roster not being a lot bigger. It appears that Brendan Burke has a lot more, and rightly has a lot more confidence in more of the guys than maybe was the case last season. And we'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. But the other thing that stood out is that this team really does have an identity, and when they get away from it, then things start to get a little dicey. Um, so let me just finish that point and then kind of go back to some of the guys who stepped up. Hartford under Brendan Burke has been the team that really does not want to possess the ball. Happily had a third of possession, and then they've been absolutely lethal when they've got the ball. they're consistently last season they were turning 36%, 37% possession into more shots and more expected goals and more actual goals than their opponents. When they had the ball, they were getting it very quickly into the opposing half, into the attacking third. They were manufacturing an opportunity, and very frequently they were turning those opportunities into goals. What we saw on Saturday against Indy was the total opposite. They got absolutely ripped open by Indy on the counter. Indy had 2 shots in the second half. They were both excellent chances, and they both went in the back of the net. And that has been Hartford. That has been Hartford doing that to other teams over the last, year or so. And I think when Brendan Burke talks about, we want to get on the ball more, we want to do these things, I can understand that aspirationally, right? That you want to be able to do different things as a club. You don't want to feel like you kind of get locked into one style of play and then you get shut down and you have nowhere to go. You want to feel like you can be more than just this club that hits you on the counter or it gets you in transition. But the reality, from my perspective, is that this is what they do well. Do the thing you do well, and no one's going to care if it was, if you win trophies with that like they did last season. Nobody cares if it's pretty, right? At the end of the day, it's when Jose Mourinho is winning, the fans of his club don't complain about the style of play, right? The fans of the opposing teams don't like it, but his fans are like, man, we're winning trophies. When you stop winning trophies, it's really unattractive to watch. And I think what we maybe see with Hartford a little bit is that the need to kind of remember what they're good at and continue doing that. Now, that said, they don't have the pieces right now. When they were good last season, they were completely bypassing the midfield, right? Sebastian Anderson on one side, Emmanuel Samadi on the other. It didn't matter that they couldn't really move the ball through the middle of the park because they were just going down the outside of everybody and manufacturing their chances that way. They're not doing that right now. Emmanuel Samadia is still in Sierra Leone. I think he was participating in an international friendly against, I think, Azerbaijan this week. I think that's who it was. And possibly won't be in the country here for another couple of weeks at least. And Matt Real is a lot of things. He's a very good defensive fullback, but he's not that dynamic attacking force. He's not getting forward in the same way. And so it's not really working the way it did last season. And so I can understand why Brendan Burke is maybe not fully committing to that style of play when he doesn't quite have the players that he wants. However, he's got more depth than he did. Last season, when guys were hurt, he didn't have someone like Matt Real to turn to. Matt Real has won a title in this league, and we're saying he's maybe the backup. And when you're in a position where you can say a guy who was a regular starter for a title-winning team is going to back up your guy when you get going, that's a really different position than Hartford has ever been in, and than Hartford certainly was in last season. Mishi Galina's missing. Adiwale Obalola's missing. Barry Coffey's missing. All these guys who are theoretically or attacking players are missing. Sadat Anaku starts. He gets a goal. He was only 6 inches away from putting the ball right on Junior Moreira's foot for an assist in the first half as well. He played very, very well. And so I think this team has got pieces that they just simply haven't had in the past, where you can say, all right, Matt Real, Sadat Anaku, Andres Hernandez, you get out there, it's going to be fine. We're not worried. We're not sacrificing anything. There's a limit to that. I don't think when you maybe get to Galen Flynn or Jack Lura, those are guys who you have as much confidence in, right? Those 25-day contract guys. But there are guys on this roster who Brendan Burke rightfully has a lot more confidence in than he did the equivalent guys at this point last season. And that's a really encouraging sign, because if Hartford can win with those guys, they can absolutely win with the guys that we all believe are better than them. And even if Emmanuel Samadi is out another couple of weeks, they're going to get results with Matt Real in the lineup. We're not worried about that falling apart. So that, I think, was really, really encouraging, even if there were some things maybe to worry about in that performance, particularly in terms of how easily they got countered.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you said, this team is built on, having a lethal counterattack. And, when you look at the stats, you see the 64% possession kind of dominating in terms of the amount of passes. You'd think that, they would be able to perform well and probably get 3 points. But when you compare, the performance in the 11, both teams had the same amount of total shots. But, Indy 11 had 1.61 XG to Hartford's 0.82. So it really seems to be like you said, that if the team's holding possession, as much as possession is great, it's what you do with it. So, it was definitely interesting to see kind of the battle between the two sides and kind of see Hartford get hit with its own medicine, if you will. And
And I will say, I think too, with like Samuel Carriaga and Barry Coffey both missing, Hartford doesn't have an attacking midfielder on the roster, right? Like a real attacking midfielder. And so if you're going to be in possession, that's the kind of player that you really need to have. And they didn't have either of those guys available. So there was maybe a bit of a key piece missing there.
definitely, definitely. But now, as we look ahead, we're going to start with the U.S. Open Cup match that takes place tomorrow as we are recording. It is the matchup between the two teams who, as we alluded to earlier in the show, have never ever faced off between each other. Definitely not multiple times in like a month. Hartford Athletic is playing Rhode Island, another edition of El Clamico. I mean, Oliver, it seemed like we were going to get a little bit of a wait before we started to see these matches take place. What was your reaction when the draw came out and we saw that Rhode Island and Hartford would not be heading up to Burlington, Vermont, or playing a USL League Two side, but they would instead be playing each other?
Why are we doing this again? Like, why? I just like, I, I understand, if U.S. Soccer wants to see Vermont Green go as deep in, or have the best chance that they can to go as deep in this tournament as possible, right? Like, Westchester is a fully professional side. They will, they will not be surprised, maybe in the way that Portland was by Vermont Green. I don't know if Vermont will be able to pull together the same roster again. Like you can do it once, but then you're trying to get these guys back together again. That can be a little challenging, right? Especially when a lot of these guys are still in college and maybe have other obligations and weren't expecting to play a second cup game. I understand though if U.S. Soccer is like Vermont Green is a great story and we want to see them go far, or have them have the chance to go far. But the reality for me is like local rivalries are one of the things that make soccer really really special, particularly like on this kind of small scale. And if you abuse that and you put those teams together too often, it really does start to lose some of its luster. I think that's actually the word that Brendan Burke used when I talked to him this week. That it stops feeling special. And I think U.S. Soccer and USL have to be very careful about how many times you put a couple of local rivals together. And to be fair to USL, like it's not like there are a ton of local rivalries that they've had to worry about in the past, right? There are not a whole lot of these very close neighbors who are competing, so it's not been a part of the calculation. But I think it is also kind of a function of like we're regionalizing the Open Cup, which I understand. So teams don't have to travel, but it does necessarily mean that these teams are going to play. We've got this regionalization of the group stage of the USL Cup, right? Of the Prinks Tires Cup, which means that Hartford and Rhode Island are going to have to play again. And I think it's probably in the best interest of both the USL and US Soccer to find ways to try and keep these teams apart other than the times they're going to meet during USL Championship play. The home and home with your local rival because you're in the same league, that's perfect. And if you advance far enough in the cup that you end up competing against one another, that's awesome. But this is a second round game. Like, this is not like they got to the quarterfinals or the semifinals, and this was kind of, the only way it could work out, or it truly happened by a random draw. This is the second round. And I just don't see the value from that perspective. I also think it creates a complication for both clubs, which is that, you've got this rivalry game coming in a competition that it doesn't really sound like either club is really prioritizing. You can't sink this one. You can't throw a bunch of academy kids or something out there and be like, yeah, fuck it, who cares, right? You'll have fans going crazy if you do that. So you have to give something, you have to put a pretty decent side out there. Well, both clubs are looking at, well, we just played on Saturday. Rhode Island just got back from Miami. Hartford are about to go to Miami. Both teams are going to play again at the weekend, right? So this is a kind of a complication, and there are complications that get thrown up in soccer all the time, right? If you advance in cup competitions, you're going to have extra games, and some of them are going to be awkward fixtures, and they're going to come ahead of a rivalry game against a local opponent, right? This happens, whether it's Manchester United, Manchester City, or whoever, Liverpool and Everton or whatever. It can happen all the time, right? But I don't know that either Brendan Burke or Connell Smith is really excited about having to navigate this fixture and put a compelling product on the field in a competition that I'm not 100% sure either one of them is particularly prioritizing at this point. And Brendan Burke has been very, very clear that it's the Saturday game in Miami. That's where the priority is. And they'll put out a side they think can compete against Rhode Island and that they believe has a chance in that game. But they're not going to do it at the expense of the league.
Yeah, and obviously with all that though, ma- imagine, tell me if I'm wrong here, that it's probably going to be, a very intense atmosphere, and maybe you don't have Anthony Saha going as crazy, but I think no matter who's out there on the pitch, and once that whistle blows, that the the energy is going to be ramped up to 10. That once you get in that moment, the players, they're still going to want to go all out and absolutely dominate, whether it's Rhode Island looking to get one over in Hartford after last year, or Hartford looking to, essentially kind of continue to have the upper hand. I guess, what is your expectation in this match, or could we see, both sides put out a decent squad, but maybe not a squad that is, as intense and, as invested in the rivalry?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of tough about rivalries at this level is that you don't necessarily, they're not well established, right? If you're playing for Liverpool, you know what the Merseyside derby is all about, right? Like there's no secrets. You know about it. This is not really the case with El Clamico yet, right? Like if you're a guy who has been, maybe played his college soccer somewhere else or played his, club soccer somewhere else, you're not like, oh my God, El Clamico, this one is really going to be a heavy atmosphere. I got to get up for it. Um, but I think to some extent the kind of natural competitiveness of these guys takes over. Brendan Burke made the point to me this week that you've got guys who are playing for contracts. Galen Flynn, Jack Lura, these are guys who are in a position where a good performance might be the difference between them getting a full professional contract for the remainder of the season or not. And I think Galen Flynn in particular is a player where if he is given that opportunity tomorrow night or Wednesday night, um, I, I think he's a player who could really see himself in line for a contract. So you have a lot of those other things going on, even though I don't necessarily know that these rivalries are kind of have the cachet and have the kind of innate inbuilt gravitas that maybe some of the big rivalries elsewhere do. Or even some of the bigger MLS rivalries, right? You think about some of those that are really people get really fired up for. I don't know that this is there yet, but of course you're going to put 11 guys on a team sheet, and they're going to go out there and they're going to give 100%. That's just the nature of this, right? This is not a league where guys are like, yeah, fuck it, whatever. It's just a cup. Who cares, right? That's not it, right? That's not happening. Um, if this was the end of the season and Hartford was like bad and guys had given up, then yeah, okay, maybe you're not going to get kind of everything from some of them. But that's not where we are. You've got guys who are still trying to play their way into full fitness. You've got guys who are playing for contracts. You've got guys who are trying to justify their minutes as other guys are coming back to full fitness. You've got guys who are saying, no, I want to still be in the starting 11. And I think on the other side, RIFC, like they are not off to a good start this season.
Mhm.
They have 1 point in the league through their first 3 games, and that's 1 point that they got in a somewhat uninspiring draw at home against Sporting Jacksonville. Sporting Jacksonville have given up at least 3 goals in every one of the other 3 games they've played, and RIFC only got 1 against them. So it wasn't a particularly encouraging performance, and so on that side of the pitch, I think Rhode Island needs to prove something. Like, I don't know what kind of side Connell Smith is going to put out there, but if let's say they, tomorrow comes, Wednesday night comes, and Hartford beats Rhode Island, And Rhode Island is looking at, we've got 1 point in the league. We've been dumped out of this competition. Like, what have we got going for us right now? That's not a really good position to be in at the very beginning of April. So, yeah, I mean, these guys are going to give it 100%, 110%, 120%. Of course they are. I just don't know that that's really being driven by the rivalry. And I do worry a little bit that, like, overexposing this rivalry means everybody gets a little bit sick of it.
Yeah, and I'd maybe love to kind of get your thoughts on Rhode Island's struggles, particularly because, I can probably only speak to Albert Dequa, seeming to perform quite well now that he's away from Rhode Island. But, Maxi Rodriguez also went back to Detroit. It seems like some of these players are doing quite well now that they've left Rhode Island. Just what do you make of their continued early season struggles, especially because even if you look back at the seasons they have gone to the Eastern Conference Finals, they have usually struggled out of the gate. Just why do you feel this team just continues to, have a really slow start?
Well, it's not really. They've never really been much of a goal scoring team, right? Like they've had a couple of games where they really blew up. I think they scored like 7 or something like that against Miami a couple of seasons ago. So it happens, right? But they're not a team that appears to be set up to score a lot of goals, and that's whether it's been J.J. Williams or Albert Dequa or whoever it is, right in front of leading the line there. It just hasn't really been a system that produces a lot of goals. And that's fine when you get to the playoffs and you don't need a lot of goals. And you're happy to get a 1-0, 2-1, 1-1 win on penalties. Like those results are fine. But it can make it a real slog to watch the team get all the way there to get to the playoffs. I will say I do think this team is in some ways a product of the way American soccer is set up, right? You've got 8 of 12 teams in the Eastern Conference or 8 of 13 are going to go to the playoffs. You don't have to be good to get to the playoffs. You just have to get there. There's no, it's not like in England where you have to get to the top to win. You have to win the league. You have to be better than everyone over the course of the entire season. You just have to get into the playoffs and then be the best team over 4 games. And I think that in some ways, the way you see a team like Rhode Island play is a reflection of that, which is we don't have to be good in March. We don't have to be good in April. We just have to get enough points along the way that we can get into the playoffs. And then our style of play is well set up to see us succeed, which it absolutely is. They've been to the Eastern Conference Finals twice. They went to the championship game. They were in the semifinals of the USL Cup last season. This is obviously a team that is well set up for knockout competition. And this league incentivizes them to do just enough to get to that stage where then they can be perform at a high level. And if you don't like that, well, take that up with USL. Take that up with the leagues that and the organizations that set up the competitions in this way.
Yeah, and now looking ahead to after that match, going up against Miami FC, a team that's kind of right below Hartford in the standings, and like we kind of talked about before the show, is kind of performing, having a good start to the year, especially after some disappointing seasons, I guess. What do you make of this Miami squad? Obviously, if you look back to how they performed against Rhode Island, seems like they have a pretty formidable attack. Just what are your expectations from this side?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny how Miami has become a little bit of a meme for being bad, right? Because up until maybe 2024, maybe 2023, they weren't bad. They were a team that had success back in when they were in NASL. When they first came over to the USL Championship, they put together some pretty expensive squads in terms of the players they acquired. And they didn't win a title or anything, but they were clearly invested in being a good team. And then they kind of gave up on that for a couple of years, and they didn't really sign anybody who was particularly good. And people were sort of like, well, they're just going to close, they're going to fold. They've got an MLS club up the road, kind of eating their lunch in their own backyard. Lionel Messi's in town. What are they doing? Just, sell the team, move the team, all this stuff. But that never really has seemed like it's likely, right? They've always seemed like they're going to stick around. And so they've taken a little bit of a different approach. They have not gone out and gone heavily invested in a ton of, top level USL talent, but they have got much more athletic. They have really put together a team that I think is much more suited to this league. We talked earlier about the physicality of the league, the athleticism of the league. That you're not really looking for a bunch of technical guys. You're looking for guys who have some speed, who have power, who can run at 1,000,000 miles an hour for 90 minutes, who can do all those things. And they've kind of gone out and done that. So they're in a much better place, and I think they're much more well set up to have some success in this league than they've been over the last couple of seasons, because they've kind of made that investment and they've been pretty well coached. I think they've done a pretty good job. And you go back to last season, towards the tail end of last season, they were starting to put it together a little bit as well. So this is a team that I think um, is on the upswing a little bit. They have put together a side that is well suited to this league. They can absolutely give Hartford problems. Hartford is still not going to be 100%. Obviously, on Saturday, they're going to preserve as many of their top guys as they can to be able to go at full strength in that game. But it could be a tough one for Hartford, because they're still not going to have everybody that they would like to have in that game.
Yeah, and I think maybe especially considering the fact that, you have the match against Rhode Island, is this potentially the time that Hartford finally maybe, taste defeat for the first time this season? Or, do you feel that there's areas of Hartford's game that could help it, be able to see a point or potentially three?
Looking at that game against Miami, I think one advantage that Hartford has is they have a lot of experience. You look at the guys they've got who've got, Augustine Williams, we've talked about him. He has like 250 appearances in the USL Championship. You have other guys on that team who have a lot of experience, whether it's Michi and Galina, whether it's Jordan Scarlett, Arturo Diz, Matt Real. They're not going to be flustered by RIFC or by Miami. They're not going to be flustered if Miami comes out and is very physical down in South Florida on Saturday. If they're pressing, if they're doing those things, they're going to have the capacity to adapt. And that's something that Brendan Burke talked about in the offseason, was that he wanted to have a squad full of guys who understood what it took to win, and didn't need to be kind of taught that, right? And obviously, you're always going to bring new guys along, right? You're going to be bringing, whether it's Mamadou Dieng or Abdullah Tawfiq, who they just signed. You're going to always bring in these guys with the intention that they'll grow. But you want an environment that is set up where there's not anything in the league that's going to surprise them. They're not going to be shell-shocked if a team comes out and runs at them, or is more athletic than they are. So I think one thing Hartford has going for it on Saturday in particular is that experience. And the fact that Hartford is also a very athletic team. I think that's something we shouldn't undersell, is that this isn't, Hartford is this veteran squad and they don't have the speed or they don't have the athleticism. Augustine Williams is very athletic. Mishin Galina, Sebastian Anderson, Junior Morera, these are guys who can run all day. And they will happily run with you all day. And, it's not ideal to be doing it on a short week, but they have that as well. And so I do think, Hartford has that opportunity. They can get a goal if they are able to kind of get back to, especially if they're able to get back to the things that have got them this far, have brought them, along in the last 18 months or so. Between that experience and between that understanding of their identity and their physical attributes, they can absolutely get results here. And I think they expect to. I don't think they're looking at this Miami game as, oh no, Miami's good, we'll be lucky to get out of there with a draw. I think they fully are going down there with the intention that we're going to get 3 points, whatever the result in Rhode Island is.
Got you, got you. And like you mentioned, Hartford does have a signing, Abdullah Tawfiq. Would love to get your thoughts on Hartford bringing him in, and just what type of role could you see him playing? Like you mentioned, Hartford's been dealing with injuries, but also has kind of conversely been a much deeper squad compared to prior years. Just where do you see Abdullah fitting in?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear from what Brendan Burke has said is that he thinks this guy is the next Mamadou Dieng. He thinks this is the guy who's going to come in, and in 18 months from now, give or take, he's going to be moving on to bigger and better things, because he's going to have demonstrated that he's worthy of that move to MLS or to somewhere else. There's definitely it's been rumored that there were MLS clubs, at least one MLS club, that was in to sign this guy, and Hartford got there first. And if that's the case, that's like really great to hear. Now, who knows, right? Like, 18-year-olds the world over don't turn out the way anybody thought they would. It doesn't matter whether Barcelona was in for them or not. Sometimes they just don't work out. When I look at him and you look at the tape, he does in fact remind me of Mamadou Dieng. Tall, they're almost exactly the same height, very lanky, long legs, has that same kind of attribute of a player who is going to run all over the pitch for 90 minutes, who's going to do every single one of those hard yards, who is going to press, who is going to um, not give up on anything in the same way that Mamadou Dieng just was constantly in motion, constantly running through every single game over the course of his time here in Hartford. And that's exactly what Brendan Burke is looking for, is a player like that. Can he finish at this level? I don't know. He scored very, very fluidly in not the Nigerian top tier, right? He's a teenager. He's playing in a developmental league. He scored 7 goals in like 250 minutes of playing time in that developmental league in their most recent set of competitions, which is very, very good, right? That's exactly what you want to see if you're like, okay, let's take this guy to the next level. But I don't know how it's going to translate. I don't know how comfortable he's going to be here in America. That's something that nobody can ever know about a player coming from abroad. I don't know what his language skills are like. I don't know how he's going to adapt to living in Hartford. I just don't know any of those components of it. On the pitch, it seems very clear that he is going to get that chance that Mamadou Dieng got, and that he is going to be, getting some of those number 9 minutes. What's interesting here that I think is a little bit different from when Mamadou Dieng came in is that when Mamadou Dieng came in, Romario Williams was the guy who was ahead of him on the depth chart. And Brandenburg was very, very quick to move on from Romario Williams, to ship him out to Indianapolis in basically a swap for Yunus Boudadi and let Mamadou Dieng have those minutes leading the line. I don't think Brendan Burke is going to be as quick to move on from Augustine Williams at the number 9. I think Augustine Williams is intended to be here for a couple of years. And so it is going to be a little bit interesting to see how quickly this club intends to bring Abdullah Tawfiq along over the next, the back half of this season or into 2027. Because I'm not sure that he's going to be immediately elevated to the starting lineup in the way that Mamadou Dieng was.
Think we could see maybe some two-striker formations, two-striker pairings up top between him and Williams.
Yeah, and I mean, they did do that a little bit last season. It was Mamadou Dieng and Michi Ngalina up top for some stretches there. I think the challenge is going to be, where do you play Michi? What do you do with Barry Coffey, Samuel Cariaga? How do you put all of these pieces together in a way that really and what about Sadat Unaku, right? Who's another guy who has a lot of qualities that you want to bring. Now, on the one hand, like having more good strikers than you know what to do with is like a very much a first world problem, right? Like there are clubs in this league that don't have any strikers that they really feel confident in. And if Hartford had 4 that they were trying to find minutes for, that would be a great problem to have. And as I have a lot of confidence in Brendan Burke's ability to manage that, manage those pieces. They could move it around. They could put 2 up top. One thing that is kind of interesting is that when Brendan Burke was the manager in Colorado Springs, they didn't really play a back 3. It was back 4 basically for 2 straight seasons there. When he came to Hartford, they started out with a back 4, and then last year kind of transitioned to this back 3 that they've stuck with. And I wonder if maybe there's an opportunity to move to something that looks a little bit different, that gets these guys on the pitch in different ways. It doesn't have to be what has kind of been a 3-5-2 or a 3-5-1-1 or something like that. It could be a 4-3-4 or a 3-4-3 or 4-2-3-1 or something like that. They could do some slightly different things in terms of the formation. And I will say, I don't know that Brendan Burke is a guy who is particularly attached to any formation. He's attached to a philosophical style, right? A way of playing the game. And the tactical formation that you put out there is just an expression of what we're doing. It's an expression of pressing. It's an expression of being fast in transition and progressing the ball up the pitch quickly, rather than just saying, oh, we're playing a 3-4-3. So you do this, you do this. This is what we're doing. And this is just who happens to be on the pitch and in a particular formation. It's not as simple as that. But the philosophy, I think, for him is much more important than the formation.
Definitely, and I guess wrapping up, I know there was a little news, if you want to call it. I know Mich- Michelle Roux, COO of Hartford Athletic, did an interview with Hartford Business Journal and seemingly indicated kind of the club's kind of aspirations for D1, the USL D1 league. I'd love to just maybe get your thoughts on where do you think Hartford stands and kind of its aspirations and kind of overall maybe institutional investment behind, going up to USL Premier, considering, like you mentioned, lots of front office turnover. And there's also the fact that if they would want to go up to the USL Premier League, they would have to upgrade their stadium unless there's some sort of loosening of restrictions. But, based off of kind of USSF, standards for a top tier league, they'd have to have a 15,000 seat stadium. Just what do you make of Hartford's looking ahead to USLD?
I don't think that right now Hartford is a great candidate for this USLD one. Um, I, I can't imagine trying to fill a 15,000 seat stadium in Hartford, particularly in March or April. Um, and honestly, even in the good months, in August and September, the months that have been historically been good months for Hartford, that would be very, very challenging to go from filling a 5,500 seat stadium to a 15,000 seat stadium. It is so much bigger. It is so many more people. Um, and this goes back to the conversation we were having about, $2 beer and things like that, right? Like if you're not building those relationships, if you're not building that fan base in that way that you're, building a waiting list for season tickets, you're not going to get to 15,000, right? Portland could probably get there, right? Thinking about their situation, Vermont Green could maybe get there, right? Thinking about how much enthusiasm there is for tickets at those clubs, but I don't, you could probably count on one hand the number of legitimate sellouts Hartford has had in their years of existence since 2019. And so I'm not really convinced that if they were to have to build a 15,000 seat stadium, and they were able to do so, because I'm also not convinced they have the money to build that, and they are absolutely not going to get any money from the city, which has its enormous budget problems of its own. And they're not going to get any money from the state, which has been ice cold on all of these. Like CT United got basically told, go away, right, when they wanted money for a stadium in Bridgeport. But Hartford is going to have to come up with $100 million to build a stadium, to go up to 15,000 to expand Trinity Health or something like that. I don't think they've got that kind of money. The other thing I'll say, we talked about kind of the front office. You can't make this jump if you're going to turn over 150% of your front office over an 18-month period. This is a long-term project to build this infrastructure, to build a stadium, to build a club that is going to compete at that level, to make the investment in the facilities that club is going to need. You're not going to be able to use the Dayhill Dome. You need your own training facility that you own and you can control. You're going to need a locker room. You're going to need training facilities, you're going to need a film room, you're going to need all of these things at a level that clubs in the USL generally don't have, and Hartford certainly doesn't have. And if that's the level of consistency and continuity in your front office, it's not going to work. Like I'll just, just as a somewhat, selfish example, like I think I've had 6 or 7 primary media contacts in, since 2024 when I started covering this club, right? And that's not really like whatever. I'm just a guy, right? I'm not like a real journalist, quote unquote, and I'm just showing up and it's not serious. But it's tough, right? It's tough to build relationships. It's tough to who you're supposed to text to say, hey, are you guys doing media? When things change. And that expands to you want to build a relationship with the city or the state to the point where they're going to be willing to give you a bunch of bond money. Well, it can't be a different person that they're talking to every 3 months when they call up to say, let's have another meeting about the stadium, right? It can't be that it's like, oh, what happened to Steven? Well, Steven doesn't work anymore. Here's, Jennifer. And then the next meeting is, oh, where's Jennifer? Oh, well, Jennifer doesn't work here anymore. It's David now. right? Like that isn't going to work because there's just going to be no confidence in the continuity. And so I just don't see it being a reasonable thing. Now, are they potentially going to pay the expansion fee and do it anyway? Maybe. But it doesn't feel like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I do think I'm here for the chaos of CT United just basically being told to leave, and then the state of Connecticut being like, "Hey, we lost the Connecticut Sun, so I think we got to invest in this Hartford soccer thing." And I will say, just based off of my experience, I think with all the teams that I cover, so Revs, Vermont Green, and I'll throw in Rhode Island FC in there, as someone who's interacted with their staff. I think in total, so 3 teams, I have had 4 media contacts. And so basically, there's only been 1 person who's left. So I would say, yes, that is quite not the norm, if you will. And I will say, Oliver, you are the only real journalist covering Hartford athletics. So don't sell yourself short. All right. So you are the best coverage of Hartford Athletic, in my humble, definitely unbiased, but actually unbiased opinion. So, kudos to you, Oliver. Again, if you haven't already, make sure to check out Oliver's work on the Blazing Musket. He just came out with a 3 thoughts article on the Indy game. He'll have plenty of coverage of the Open Cup game and upcoming matches. And we just really appreciate everyone who has listen to the podcast. We're gonna go for our first not 2 week stint. We're gonna come back on the 8th to talk about the Miami match. There was simply too much soccer and too much happening. So we wanted to get all of that in and not have an insanely long podcast. So if you aren't already, make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. We also post the videos on YouTube. We just got over 300 subscribers. If we could keep that going, it'd be greatly appreciated. We have a ton of other content, whether it's the Blazing Musket podcast or just general videos. Esmir Bartarovic just somehow got Bosnia into the World Cup, and I think our biggest video we ever did was just a translated video of Esmir talking about playing for Bosnia. So if you are an Esmir Bartarovic fan who also wants to learn about Hartford Athletic, we're the place for you, pal. But
All
again,
4 of you, we're the place for you.
yes. But really appreciate everyone who listens, and shout out to all of the average fans out there. And Oliver, thanks again. Always enjoy chatting with you.
Thanks, Sam.